110 years ago, Arnold van Gennep, a German-born French citizen of Dutch patrilineal descent, published an ethnographic work called, in translation, The Rites of Passage. Van Gennep discerned 3 stages in every ritual that celebrates an individual's life changes from one status to another. Those 3 stages are separation, transition, and incorporation. Later in the 20th century, the British social anthropologist Victor Turner further developed Van Gennep's paradigm, demonstrating how in some cultural settings, the in-between transition phase can become permanent. Thus, a monk or a nun, Christian or Buddhist, has embraced a permanent transition status. An Okomfo in Akan settings in Ghana, a possession priest, also lives in such permanent transition. The sacred nature of the in-between status and its holder is extremely important. In the funeral liturgy this morning, we celebrate the in-between of our beloved husband, father, brother, father-in-law, grandfather, relative, colleague, and friend, Lamin Sanneh. We mourn his passing from our midst. We also celebrate his death because we have faith, as Lamin had faith, that God, his vindicator, lives. Lamin has gone through the door of death and is even now incorporated into the body of the risen Lord. Lamin Sanneh was, although no monk or possession priest, a man always in transition, a man who lived on borderlines in borderlands. We are much obsessed with borders these days in the United States. Lamin came from a country that is all borders, the Gambia. Its western border is the Atlantic, those beaches stained with the blood of the slave trade. The Gambia's upriver states border the Republic of Senegal on every side for more than 300 miles. Lamin himself was born on McCarthy Island, surrounded by the waters of the River Gambia as they make their way slowly westwards, down to the estuary and into the ocean. Lamin knew what it was to live on borders. Job, whose cry we hear in the first reading, lived in the land of Uz. Where is Uz? Nobody is quite sure. Ancient Egypt, Haran in what is now Syria, Edom in what is now Jordan. No one knows. One thing is sure. This giant of the Hebrew Bible did not live in the home of the Hebrew Bible, Israel. Job lived on the borderlines of suffering and destruction and death. But in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Job lived his borderline life of faith in deep hope. But as for me, I know that my vindicator lives, and that he will at last stand forth upon the dust, whom I myself shall see. My own eyes, not another's, shall behold him, and from my flesh I shall see God. My inmost being is consumed with longing. The Gambia, Senegal, Mali, Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, and parts of nearby countries took their origins from what was once the Manding Empire. Born into a chieftaincy household, Lamin had about him a sense of physical dignity that bespoke such noble origins. An ardent Muslim in his youth, Lamin memorized the Quran and revered its teachings and his instructors, who raised him in its discipline. Lamin also liked secular schooling and excelled enough to be sent downriver for further secondary education in the then colonial capital of the Gambia colony, named Bathurst then and Banjul today. It was a lonely life for a boy raised upriver. His cityfied classmates from Gambia High School, and even the family with whom he boarded, found him too pious a Muslim for them. Little did they know that Lamin was gradually questioning elements of his Muslim faith, as he questioned everything. One thing that puzzled Lamin as a young boy was the Quranic account of what happened to Jesus at the end of his mortal life. The actual death of Jesus, most Muslims contend, is denied by the Quran. I myself think that the text of the Quran simply denies that the crucifixion of Jesus was a victory over Jesus by his enemies. Let me quote from the Surah Al-Nisa. They neither killed him nor crucified him, but it appeared like that to them. See now, they are in disagreement about him and they are in doubt about him. They have no knowledge about him except following conjectures. They certainly did not kill him. Moreover, God raised him up to himself. God is mighty and wise. In any case, the death of Jesus on the cross, to say nothing of its salvific effect, is completely foreign to Muslim thinking. It was, coincidentally and strangely, a British atheist, a minor functionary in the late colonial Gambian administration, who shocked Lamin one day in Bathurst with the information that, I quote, "It appeared to be a settled fact of history," unquote, that Jesus died on a cross. The British atheist immediately added, however, that it proved nothing about there being a God at all. It took some time for Lamin to regain his equilibrium. It took even longer for him to see in the crucified and risen Jesus his reason for living. It took time for Lamin to find comfort in the words of St. Paul we heard in our second reading. Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a human being, the resurrection of the dead came also through a human being. Lamin became a Methodist Christian as a young man because the Irish Catholic priest, later a bishop, whom he sought out in Bathurst about entering the church, told him that he was only in rebellion against his father and refused him baptism. Lamin and that bishop discussed the issue years later when Lamin had finally come into full communion with the Catholic Church, and the bishop still defended his original stance. The bishop was Irish, and we Irish are very difficult people. The Methodist missionary who did baptize Lamin assured him that the Catholic Church recognizes the validity of Methodist baptism. Lamin first told me that he wanted to enter into full communion with the Catholic Church just after I had celebrated Mass with him on the coffee table in his Hampden home in the spring of 1998. I had come to visit him shortly after he had undergone a kidney operation. A year later, during the celebration of the Easter Vigil at the chapel in the St. Thomas More Center here at Yale, Lamin was received into full communion with the Catholic Church by the beloved and now late Father Bob Beloin. I would have been Lamin's godfather, but I was stationed in Rome at that time. In fact, I was actually visiting Nigeria that Easter weekend in preparation for my next assignment in the bright continent. Thus it was that Father Avery Dulles, my former teacher and a newly found mentor for Lamin, did the honors. When Dulles was named a cardinal by Pope St. John Paul II, a little less than 2 years later, I wrote to Lamin and told him that he now had something in common with John Leo Africanus, born in Andalusia as Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan al-Fazi, whose godfather at his baptism in Rome in 1520 was Giovanni de' Medici, Pope Leo X. You will remember Pope Leo X as the man who, when he acceded to the papacy, said, "God has given us the papacy, let us now enjoy it." He is not Saint Leo X. Lamin became a Christian and a Catholic, but he never renounced all that was good and true and holy in the faith of Islam. His first scholarly book and his last are both about the tradition of Muslim pacifism, a tradition too little known in this bellicose country and probably too little known in much of the Muslim world as well. Lamin studied the Jahanke Muslim clerics in the Senegambia region, who from the Middle Ages on renounced jihad to pursue lives of peaceful chaplaincy and trade. They were basically Sufis who propagated Islam by good example. They were peacemakers, prayer makers, amulet makers. They were not war makers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Lamin Sanneh participated in that peaceful tradition of Islam and that peaceful tradition of Christianity. He lived a peaceful life and died a peaceful death. Al-Baqa lillahi, Muslims say in Arabic. Only God is everlasting. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Truly we belong to God, and to God alone we will return. In the Catholic Christian tradition we pray, Requiem aeternam, dona ei Domine, et lux perpetua lucia Dei. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen. I miss you, my brother, Lamin, the faithful one. We all miss you. Your beloved Sandra, Kelefa, and Sia and their families miss you. As you kept faith with God and kept faith with us, stay with us on our journeys of faith as we follow you down the river, into the estuary, and westward toward the ocean of eternal life.
Thank you all so much for being here today. It is impossible to sum up the extraordinary life of my father, Lamin Sanneh, in a few minutes, and I won't try to do that now. But I will just say a few words about my dear, wonderful dad and what he means to our family. All of you who knew my father are familiar with his deep love of scholarship. His mind was always moving, asking questions, thinking of new ideas, exploring an historical event with great enthusiasm. It seemed to us that he had an entire library in his mind. And he was thumbing through the pages, comparing passages, revisiting texts with new perspectives, a mind that was never still. Dating back to when I was a kid, I remember countless mornings when, as I was having my first sip of coffee or tea and only half awake, he would burst into the kitchen and without warning engage me in any manner of rich and nuanced academic ideas. A new thought he had about millennialism, an interesting and commonly misunderstood aspect of Sharia law, all as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning, Minnie," he would exclaim cheerfully as he reached for a jar of marmalade. I do wonder if people understand what the clerics were actually doing when they engaged the government. It was quite sophisticated. Learning was such a source of joy and daily inspiration to him. He was determined to provide me and my brother Kay with the richest educational opportunities he and my mother could find. He did that and so much more, sending us to some of the most incredible schools in the world. Our family was able to afford this education in part because my dad saved and saved and saved his whole life. He delighted in being thrifty. He loved a deal. His shirts came primarily on deep discount from TJ Maxx. He told me more than once with a completely straight face that food actually tasted better to him had it been purchased on discount, or better yet, acquired free of charge. These days, he was focused on making sure his grandkids, Doc and Ronald, could have the tremendous gift of learning that transformed his life. A few months ago, he recounted spending quite some time in an airport, eyeing a bottle of water in a vending machine, thirsty, with money in his pocket, trying to come to terms with the hefty price tag. In the end, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He decided to wait for the free water on the flight. "Another penny for Doc's college fund," he cheerfully exclaimed. Of course, the joy my dad found in securing a bargain dates back to his childhood in the Gambia, growing up near the culture of the marketplace. Those sights and sounds and smells never left him. He brought that rich culture to our home in so many ways. When I think of our family, I think of us gathered around the table, eating West African food, listening to his favorite music, the sounds of the kora from Gambia and Mali. He was a superb chef who loved surprising my mother by making a fresh pot of benachin or domoda, West African stews, the preparation of which he approached with scholarly concentration, refining the ingredients, creating twists on classic versions, and hiding hot peppers in the dish to keep you on your toes. He was, of course, tremendously supportive of the kids, as he called my brother and me. As my brother became a published writer, he would meticulously clip Kay's articles out of the newspaper, including the ones about musicians he had never heard of, keeping every hard copy, and at times proudly displaying them on the door of his office. He cheered when I graduated from Yale Law School and promptly decided to move to Alabama to represent incarcerated people on death row. He pored over my legal briefs, historical reports, trial transcripts. He never questioned me on whether this path was financially sound. It wasn't really. He just reminded me that there was always a plane ticket home when I needed a visit. He was deeply engaged in all aspects of our lives. He read our school papers and essays, and even when we were in middle school, challenged us on points of historiography where we may have been oversimplifying. We groaned when we discovered he wanted to bring a VHS tape recorder to our school performances, to document family history, he would say. When I was in college, he pored over the syllabi for my history classes and later accepted recommendations for what would become our informal book club. More recently, we had been discussing and exchanging books and readings on slavery and the differences between transatlantic slavery and slavery in the Islamic world. He took great pleasure in being the family problem solver. He was thrilled when, even in the midst of an important lecture series he was giving, he could intervene with the airline to address some travel snafu of a family member. He loved to surprise my mom when she was away by fixing some issue in the house, a leaky roof, a problem with the bathroom tile. "Sand will be so surprised," he would say, with great delight. As a teenager, when I found myself stranded in Greece with an expired green card, he was my only call and found a way to bring me home. A decade ago, when my car broke down on the way back from a prison in rural Alabama, he somehow arranged for it to be fixed, even though he was halfway across the country. I once arrived back home at my parents' house after a trip to Zimbabwe and discovered that a small sculpture I received there had broken in transit. A few days later, there it sat, miraculously in our living room. My dad had quietly and painstakingly glued each piece back together. What an exquisite metaphor for my father. His pride in our family knew no bounds, and he was especially proud of my mother. Her intellect and deep interest in languages profoundly shaped his life and work, but he was equally proud of her character and the way she lived out her faith and their shared values. A few days before this past Christmas, he wrote a note to the kids about her. He had come downstairs at 6 a.m., unusually early for him, and he was sipping some guava juice when he saw my mom standing outside in the dark in the blustery cold wind. She was waiting for the folks who do trash collection so she could catch them in person, shake their hands, thank them, and give them a holiday gift. "What a trooper," my dad wrote, making sure somebody has a small something for Christmas cheer. He remarked how much my mother embodied the spirit of Advent. Our last days together were the happiest, celebrating Christmas with his beloved grandsons, watching Arsenal with his son-in-law JP, recounting stories of his childhood in the Gambia, over his daughter-in-law's apple pie. He told us this was the happiest Christmas of his life. It was the happiest of ours, too. As we try to come to terms with his sudden departure from this life, we are holding on to that feeling, his joy, his humor, his love, and the faith he had in God and in us.
So, here we are. There's family here from near and far, friends, colleagues, a beautiful eulogy from my sister Sia, homily from Father Pat, plenty of parking, It didn't start too early in the morning. Temperature's not too cold. The chairs are reasonably comfortable. There's plenty of leg room. And there's even a rumor that there are some refreshments afterward. All told, my dad would have loved this. He loved gatherings like this. And there have been lots of gatherings in the last week. In his final days in the hospital, the family was there, my mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, my wife and I. My dad was wearing a wool hat to keep him warm, and we took an iPhone, played some choral music on the iPhone, and tucked it into the brim of the woolen hat. And the doctors weren't sure if he could hear it, but my mom was pretty sure he could. More recently, we've had some bigger gatherings. The other night, some of our family members came over to the house, my Aunt Sajo, my cousins Yama and Sanneh and their families. In these last years especially, Sanneh has been a real nucleus, a real connection to Gambia and to the rest of our family. He meant so much to my father. I've been moved, too, to hear about the gathering in Gambia yesterday at the house of my uncle, my father's brother, Uncle Doctor, they called him. People came from all around, from the provinces, and gathered at Uncle Doctor's house. My dad would have loved that, too. His connection to his family in the Gambia was sometimes complicated, as family connections sometimes are, but it was central to who he was. In the last week, I've had the chance to go over his life story again and again with family members, with reporters, and each time I learned something new about my dad. And each time I also have the same reaction. I imagine him as a young boy in Janjanbureh. He was born on May 24th, 1942. At least that's what we always said. My Aunt Sajo says that she suspects he might have been born days, months, or even years earlier than that. That's a pretty good example of how we always learn something new. He was called Karamo, or Malamin Suti. In Someone from the Margin, his memoir, he talked about his boyhood. He talked about his memory of the first time he ate marshmallows, which he loved. He talked about okra, which he hated. Some of you in this room, anyone who's ever been with him to a restaurant where okra is served, probably already knows that. He talked about how sometimes he was brave enough to swim in the Gambia River, braving crocodiles and hippos. It really was a different world. And I wonder what his reaction would have been as a boy if someone had taken him aside and told him all the amazing things that he might do. If someone had told him that he would excel at school and move to the big, bustling city of Banjul. If someone had told him that he would win a scholarship to go to college in America, to do graduate work in Lebanon and the UK, to have this extraordinary and provocative academic career, to spend these decades helping people gently but firmly rethink their preconceptions about the history of Islam, about the nature of Christian missionary work, about the relationship between faith and civil society. I wonder what his reaction would have been if you'd told him he would build a life in America, first at Harvard and then at Yale, not too bad, surrounded by this international community of people he inspired, some of them through his many books, some of them just through casual conversation. I wonder what he would have said if you told him he'd be married 45 years to his lifelong partner, my mother, Sandra Sanneh, an African scholar too, and an unbelievable wife and mother, not coincidentally, an incredibly patient person as well. I wonder what his reaction would have been if you had told him about my sister and me, his kids, whom he loved to brag about her husband, JP, and my wife, Sarah, whom he welcomed into his family. I wonder what his reaction would have been if you'd have told him that one day he'd get to hang out with his grandsons, Doc and Ronnie. Hey, I'm almost done, Doc. Thanks for doing such good sitting and listening. Doc and Ronnie, who always wanted him to play trains with them or read with them, who were his eager co-conspirators on ice cream runs. If you had told my dad, that little boy in Janjambare, if you had told him all of that, I bet his eyes would have gone wide. I bet his mind would have started racing. And I bet he would have said, with no hesitation, "I'll take it." And he did. He took it. 76 years, maybe more, Auntie Sarjo. An amazing life. We miss him, but we'll take it.